The Big Bang Theory. Why would that lend support to a theory of a God?
The picture of the universe that has emerged is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
That comes back to the idea of a designer of all this. Are you prepared to accept you could just be completely wrong? Now, my big question for all atheists, is okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is...
Piers Morgan, known for his hard-hitting questions, sat across from Stephen C. Meyer, a scientist who was ready to defend his view of the universe and the existence of God. The interview was meant to be just another discussion about science and belief. But things quickly took an unexpected turn.
I absolutely do, yeah. And I think when I was on the Rogan program, he was probing about both the objective evidence for belief in God and my subjective experience. And I would never base an argument to another scientist or philosopher on my subjective experience. But I think belief in God has, I think, legitimate objective and subjective basis. And I think that mysterious moment when you see a loved one passing, when the body is there, but the person is gone, it raises some profound metaphysical questions, or maybe a metaphysical awareness that there is something more than the material that is part of all of us.
So in a way...
Morgan, skeptical as ever, questioned the very existence of Jesus, dismissing the idea that history could confirm what Christians believe. He was confident, sure that science had no room for faith. But his guest, a scientist with a deep knowledge of both history and physics, wasn't about to let the claim go unchallenged.
Oh, the single cell as opposed to the universe.
Well, I guess you go back to the universe,
and
then you go back to the creation of a single cell that has this incredible complexity that eventually, through the process of evolution, leads to human beings.
Yeah, I do think there's...
Do you believe that's really the most likely scenario?
Yeah, I do think there's incredible evidence of intelligent design at the point of the origin of life, because that first simple cell, in the 19th century, Thomas Huxley said that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm.
Brilliant phrase.
Wonderful. He was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, but we know so much more now that he didn't know. And what we now know is that inside even the simplest cell, we have digital nanotechnology. We have the information stored in the DNA. We have an exquisite system of information storage, transmission, and processing. And that information is being used to build protein machines and other even more complex nanomachinery inside the cell. So it's a sort of automated factory run by digital information. People didn't know about that in the early 19th century.
But do you believe, like I said, originally there's just one single solitary...
Piers Morgan, like many skeptics, suggests that Jesus may never have existed, dismissing the Bible as biased and unreliable. He demands independent, non-religious evidence that Jesus was a real historical figure. Meyer immediately dismantles this claim by pointing out that no serious historian denies Jesus' existence. There are multiple historical sources outside of the Bible that confirm Jesus as a real person.
What you went through with your mother may have actually intensified your own belief in your theory about all this.
Yeah, sure.
Because you felt it.
Yeah, exactly.
You see, that's where whenever I argue with atheists, I'm always struck by their refusal to go there into stuff like that. And yet they must themselves, through their own life experiences, have moments and experiences which must test their own conviction that there is nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a both-and thing if you're a believer. There's plenty of good, solid scientific evidence, good philosophical reasons for belief, but then there are these experiences too that we have along the way that suggest it's not just matter in motion. There's more to the world than the material stuff.
When you hear someone like Richard Dawkins, when he's so emphatic that he's right, and believing in gods like believing in fairies and all this kind of thing, do you respect that, or do you think it's just performative?
Well, I honestly, he signed a book for me once in a...
He pointed out that the most notable are Tacitus, Roman historian, 1st century AD, who mentions Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate and acknowledges early Christians as a growing movement. Another was Josephus, Jewish historian, 1st century AD, who described Jesus as a wise teacher and references his crucifixion. Both of these men were not Christians. They had no reason to fabricate Jesus' existence. But guess what? Meyer wasn't quite done showing Morgan his true place.
Forced by those big questions because the human brain cannot come up with any other logical explanation. So a logical explanation based on science and data, it doesn't exist.
And this is not God of the gaps. Okay, there are gaps there for materialism, but the materialists assume that any explanation that doesn't involve a purely material process is an explanation that is just filling a mere gap. But the rules of explanation are a little different than that. A good explanation provides a causally adequate explanation, where you infer an entity which, if true, would be capable of generating.
This leaves Morgan in a difficult position. If he denies Jesus' existence, he must also reject much of ancient history.
And therefore explaining the thing of interest. We look at the origin of the universe, and we understand that matter, space, time, and energy come into existence. Then prior to that, there's no matter again to do the causing. So materialistic explanations are inherently inadequate, and yet positing an external entity that has volition and agency does fit the bill. If true, that would provide a positive explanation.
So here's the
for
tough
original
question.
universe.
Because I've had family members who've renounced their faith over the Holocaust, for example. Right? How could a fair, just God allow that to happen? When you look at what's happened in Israel and then Gaza in the last...
Morgan then shifts his attack from history to science, claiming that modern discoveries have removed the need for God. Many atheists argue that as science explains more about the universe, belief in God becomes obsolete. But Meyer flips the argument on its head. He explains that far from disproving God, science actually strengthens the case for a creator. The Big Bang Theory, which is widely accepted in the scientific community, states that the universe had a beginning.
Or the major innovations in the history of life.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are three big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang Theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God? Or God?
Right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were.
This presents a major problem for atheism. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause.
And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes. And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What in fact the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself, because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing. And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external.
Just then, Morgan quickly tries to interrupt, arguing that scientists don't know what came before the Big Bang.
You know, my big question for all atheists, is okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened.
But Meyer points out that this is exactly where belief in God makes sense. Before the universe existed, there was no time, space, or matter. Whatever caused the universe must exist outside of these things. It must be timeless, immaterial, and powerful.
We can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state.
That explanation perfectly matches the definition of God. Science, rather than eliminating God, actually provides strong evidence for a supernatural creator who exists beyond the physical universe. But Piers Morgan is far from convinced.
Before this all started, in other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened, because we can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
And do you believe that God created this original single cell from which everything flows to us?
At this point, seeing how every argument he brings up is destroyed, Morgan then shifts to evolution, believing it eliminates the need for a creator. Darwin proved how he got here, he argues.
Ben Shapiro. Now, I'm glad to say, uncensored. This all blew up last week because Tucker Carlson went on Joe Rogan. And I don't know if you saw this, but he said this about this very issue. Take a look.
If evolution is real, and if there is this constant, I don't know, but it's visible. Like, you can measure it in certain animals.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence that in fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Right?
In what sense?
Well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, all life emerged from a single cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not.
Your response?
Well, I don't know what Tucker knows about all this, but
Probably not as qualified as you, but he likes to
it was something
ask
that
around.
happened here in London a few years ago, 2016, a major conference convened by the Royal Society, arguably the world's most august and prestigious scientific body, was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And many of the conveners are calling for a new theory because the primary mechanism of biological change articulated by Darwin and his subsequent followers, now called the neo-Darwinists, the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations, is now understood to lack the creative power to generate major change.
But Meyer does more than explain to clarify a crucial point all of us might have missed. Evolution only explains how life changes over time. It does not explain how life began in the first place.
Of life.
And is the crux of this debate, is it, as Tucker was getting at there, is it that if you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated, the body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's two issues, really. There's how do you get to the first life from the simpler non-living chemicals? That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest Richard Dawkins, acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet.
Darwin assumed that life started with a simple cell. But today, science has revealed that there is no such thing as a simple cell. According to him, every living cell contains coded information, DNA, which functions like computer software. It contains microscopic machines, proteins, and molecular motors that build and repair the cell, as well as a system that reads and translates genetic instructions, similar to artificial intelligence.
But even that now is being challenged because the main mechanism of evolutionary change does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation. What Tucker was referring to, I think, is adaptation. This would be examples like Darwin's finches, where the beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns. But it does a very poor job of explaining the major innovations in the history of life, such as the origin of birds or mammals or animals in the first place. And there in the fossil record, we do see very abrupt, many instances of very abrupt appearance without the transitional intermediates that you'd expect on the basis of the Darwinian picture of the tree of life.
So is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails then?
I think it does fail. I think it captures an element of the truth. There's the small-scale microevolutionary variation is certainly a real process, and no one disputes that. Natural selection is a real process, but what's at issue now is the degree to which it has genuine creative power. And I think at this 2016 conference, the opening talk was given by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, not an American talk show host, and he enumerated 5 major explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, many of them surrounding this problem that the mechanism lacks the generative or creative power necessary to...
Now, where did this highly complex information-based system come from? Because if we look into science, random processes do not create information, taking the cause and effect theory into consideration. No one believes that a computer program writes itself by accident. So why would anyone believe DNA, which is even more advanced than human software, was created by chance?
Oh, that's created.
Well, right. Presumably, that's where...
Is that what you think?
I do think there was an original cell that was created.
Because the theory of evolution says the journey from single cell to the full complexity of life on Earth and so on happened by random trial and error. But your position, I think, is that it's so complicated, this original single cell, so complex for all the reasons you just articulated, that that's just simply not feasible, that it would be just random trial and error. It had to be the creation of some superior entity.
Right.
Is that right?
Well, again, there's two contexts. There's the how do you get to the first cell, And then how do you get from the first cell to everything else? Let's just take the origin of the first cell.
You think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
And then out of the universe comes the creation of a single cell, which again is God.
Right. Here's the evidence, though, that when we see information in a digital or alphabetic or typographic form, and this is what we actually see in the DNA, when Francis Crick elucidated what he called the sequence hypothesis in the late 1950s, he realized that the 4 subunits along the interior of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a second.
Even atheist scientists admit that Darwinian evolution cannot explain the origin of life. Meyer makes it clear, while evolution may describe small changes in living things, it does not remove the need for a creator. Here now, you can see how Morgan grows frustrated. He is of the opinion that just because life is complex doesn't mean God did it. But Meyer takes it further, showing that life isn't just complex, it's designed.
Software. What we know from experience is that whenever we say information of that sort, it always comes from a mind. Bill Gates, our local hero, has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that it functions like a machine code. Well, what we know is that software comes from a programmer. And in fact, whenever we see information of that kind, whether it's in a software program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, it always arises from a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life and even the simplest living cell, I argue, is decisive evidence of the activity of a designing mind.
He explains that inside every cell, there are microscopic machines, tiny engines, transport systems, and assembly lines more advanced than anything humans have ever engineered. These biological machines operate with precision and efficiency, directing energy, building proteins, and maintaining the cell's functions. Bill Gates once said that DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software we've ever created. If we found a fully functioning computer on Mars, we would assume an intelligent mind built it. Yet many scientists reject the idea that DNA, a system infinitely more advanced, could be the result of a designer.
Of life.
What is the Goldilocks zone? Another of your big bedrocks of your book.
Well, this is one way that the physicists refer to something that they call the fine-tuning of the universe, or sometimes they talk about it, the anthropic fine-tuning. The idea is that the most fundamental parameters of physics fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances, outside of which we have discovered life would not be possible. Even basic chemistry would not be possible. So the force responsible for the expansion of the universe, called the cosmological constant, is fine-tuned. An accepted value is to 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. So a smidge faster or slower in that expansion, and you either get a heat death of the universe or you get a big crunch, a great black hole. In either case, life is not possible. That's just one of many parameters that fall within that kind of a sweet spot. So sometimes the physicists do talk about our living in a Goldilocks universe. Luke Barnes has written a wonderful book about the fine-tuning. A physicist who also did his PhD at Cambridge has written a book called The Fortunate Universe. So these types of terms are now making their way into physics because physicists did not expect that life would depend upon such an exquisitely and improbably arranged set of basic parameters. But there we have it. They did.
Morgan tries to dismiss this as coincidence, but Meyer challenges him. If intelligence is the only known source of complex information, why would we assume life, containing the most sophisticated information code, came from mindless processes? At this point, Morgan is running out of arguments. Morgan, now on the defensive, insists that even if life is complex, that doesn't mean the universe was designed. Maybe we just got lucky. But Meyer refutes this using the fine-tuning argument. If gravity were slightly stronger or weaker, stars and planets couldn't form. If the universe expanded too fast or too slow, life wouldn't exist. If the Earth were slightly closer or farther from the Sun, the planet would be uninhabitable. The odds of all these factors aligning perfectly by chance are so low that many scientists admit the universe appears fine-tuned. Even Fred Hoyle, an atheist astrophysicist, eventually admitted, it looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, chemistry, and biology.
But again, that comes back to the idea of a designer of all this.
Well, one of the scientists who first discovered these fine-tuning parameters was Fred Hoyle. And Hoyle was a pretty aggressive scientific atheist. He opposed the Big Bang and even gave the Big Bang its name, the Big Bang, as a kind of pejorative to make fun of the concept. But after he discovered some of these fine-tuning parameters, he had a shift in his philosophical perspective, in his worldview. And he was later quoted as saying that a common sense interpretation of the data, the fine-tuning data, suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. And I would say I love the way the monkeys always make it into the origins discussion, even if it's in physics.
Always goes back to monkeys.
Always monkeys, either at a typewriter.
This leaves Morgan with a difficult choice: deny the evidence or admit that the universe looks designed for life. What does he do now? Pivoting.
He said this: what was there before the beginning of the universe? Everyone asks this question. What's the simple answer?
Oh, I'm delighted I can respond to you. We don't know. But we got top people working on it. Okay.
You know what?
There may have been a multiverse.
I like that. I like the honesty. So we genuinely don't know. People just don't know, right?
We don't know. There might have been a multiverse that's birthing universes, and we're one of them. But that just pushes the question one step further before that. What was around before the multiverse? So we just don't know. It's a frontier question right now.
What is your response? I mean, a lot of astrophysicists and Elon Musk and others think it's actually about the multiverse. For those who don't know, what is the multiverse? And what's your response to that?
Sure. The multiverse is the idea that, yes, the universe is incredibly finely tuned against all odds.
With all his arguments dismantled, Morgan makes one last claim that science doesn't prove God. It's just an interpretation. See how Meyer absolutely dismantles Piers Morgan's erroneous denial of the existence of Jesus Christ. Did you find any aspect of Meyer's argument you found interesting? Kindly share with us in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.